Hello, all. Thank you for tuning in for the History of Stereotypes dialogue series on food stamps. My name is Kendall Taylor-Wright. I'm an equity peer leader at MSU Denver with the Center for Multicultural Engagement and Inclusion Department. So let's go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to begin with a short video that gives us a little bit of an intro into the topic of food assistance programs.
The Trump administration is on track to institute some controversial changes to the country's food assistance program. But how did that government benefit become the system people know today? The country's food assistance is officially known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, but it's commonly referred to as food stamps. And that name derives from the early versions of the program that literally used stamps. The first food stamp program was started in 1939 to help address both widespread unemployment and food surpluses. Eligible families bought orange food stamps and used them to buy whatever food they wanted. For every $1 of orange stamps they purchased, they received 50 cents in blue stamps. The blue stamps could only be used to buy foods the government said were in surplus. That program ended in 1943. And it was 18 years before the government started a food assistance program up again. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy launched a food stamp pilot program. It worked a lot like the previous one, since families still had to purchase food stamps. But the stamps became cheaper. For example, a family that paid $22 for food stamps would receive $62 in vouchers. The Kennedy pilot program was tested in select regions around the country. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Food Stamp Act, making the program permanent. Various laws have modified it since then, changing the eligibility guidelines, work requirements, or funding levels. Notably, in 1977, under President Jimmy Carter, Congress eliminated the purchase requirement, which meant the government started distributing food stamps to eligible families for free. Today, families get their SNAP benefits delivered electronically into an account they use like a debit card. They can buy foods like fruits, vegetables, meat, bread, cereal, and snacks. But the benefits can't be used to buy alcohol, vitamins or supplements, prepared foods, or household products like cleaning supplies or pet food.
Wonderful. Now, before we get deeper into the history of food assistance program, I just want to go ahead and throw out a disclaimer. This lecture is meant to provide you with a basic understanding to better develop thoughts and questions around the topic. These are dated and cited facts about the development of food assistance programs. In this presentation, I'm trying to keep it about 15 minutes, but we'll see what that looks like at the end. But please note that there are going to be inevitable gaps as I'm trying to discuss major changes and events that cultivate how we interact with the program in present time. So let's go ahead and discuss a quick timeline, and then we'll go into each of these milestones. So I did start the timeline in 1619. I did that not only to highlight an aspect of US history, but to note the colonization and enslavement of Africans and the genocide of indigenous peoples. Then becoming most important in 1865 with the abolishment of slavery with the 13th Amendment. With the abolishment and with the Civil War coming to an end, we have Reconstruction beginning in 1865, lasting until 1877. During this time in Reconstruction, we see the Freedmans Bureau be created, and this was meant to be a temporary program lasting from 1865 to 1872. Now, also noting these dates, with the end of Reconstruction in 1877, with that Freedman Bureau in between, we see the beginning of Jim Crow in 1877, lasting until the 1960s. During this time of Jim Crow, we have the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939. After, as we come out of Jim Crow era, but before the final acts in 1964, we have JFK's campaign in 1961. This is going to be a pivotal moment as discussed in the video. The next big moment that helps define how we understand the program today would be 1970, with President Carter removing the buy-in aspect of food assistance programs. What we also have in the 70s is the war on drugs. So starting with the Freedmans Bureau, a couple of things to note. The Freedmans Bureau encompassed refugees, abandoned lands in quotations, which we understand it refers to indigenous nations, and freedmen and newly freed Black folks. In these programs, they taught people how to read, write. They provided temporary assistance regarding clothing, food, housing, but unfortunately, white supremacy wouldn't let it be. Yes, it was in fact vetoed twice and still upheld. There was a white outcry of why are we helping these non-white folks when white people need help too? This is a brief acknowledgement of disparities in wealth and various forms of social literacy with newly granted citizenship in acclimating into white society. So what we are seeing right now is a political cartoon from 1866. It reads, "The Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, and made a law by Congress. Support the Congress and you support the Negro. Sustain the President and you protect the white man." So here we can discuss the stereotype associated with the ironic stereotype with Black folks, as they are the ones who build the nation as far as labor is concerned, being called idle or lazy when they don't want their labor to be exploited. With the end of the program, it allowed socioeconomic issues to become systematic, and initial issues around societal integration left to fester and expand. With the next reemergence of the program is with the Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. A couple of things to note in the dynamic of race relations at the time. With the New Negro Alliance, protests were being held, "Don't shop where you can't work." As yes, the Great Depression affected everybody, but the need for equitable housing, living, working situations was still not being addressed. Therefore, yes, with the creation of a food stamp program in 1939, what we are also seeing is discriminatory practices on who receives the aid. So in the situation of who receives the aid with the first recipient in the New Deal, is going to be an upstate Rochester, New York resident by the name of Mabel McFagan. And that was in May 16th, 1939. Something too to note when we are discussing race relations and discussing the discriminatory aspects and what non-white individuals were still facing in trying to rebuild and create structure and stability in their lives, is when the Great Depression hit, so many people were affected, but overall poverty and the aspect of need becomes a white problem, not just a non-white problem. With that being said, the program ended in spring of 1943, since, quote, "the conditions that brought the program into being unmarketable food surpluses and widespread unemployment, no longer existed." From here, we are not seeing the acknowledgement of generational wealth gap disparities. And also by this time, we are seeing practices like redlining, sharecropping, and other gray areas of exploitation of labor within a capitalist system. So let's continue. So what we are looking at here is during JFK's campaign, he was extremely dependent on the poor white vote, and in particular sought out West Virginia to appeal to them, and in so made a part of his campaign to bring into food assistance programs, where you get his initiative of the food stamp pilot program, February 2nd, 1961. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson signs this in and makes it permanent in 1964 after the assassination of JFK. With that being said, this lovely black and white photo that we were seeing of the two couple, the Graney, is actually Mr. and Mrs. Alderson Munsey of Painesville, West Virginia. And they were the first food stamp recipients under the new program in May 29, 1961, utilizing West Virginia as an example pilot program to then be taken nationwide. Again, addressing aspects of poverty centering around white poverty, which is absolutely inevitable. It definitely must be said in the breath of white privilege that white privilege does not mean that you did not have a rough life. It means that your race was not an obstacle. Also, something to note in the picture of JFK's campaign on a chair is there is a young boy with a gun in his hand that's quite literally pointing it at him. During that time, it might have been a costume prop, but considering circumstances, it might actually be real. And I find that to be very interesting. Side note. So let's go ahead and continue on. So as we move into the 70s, again, with the aspect of President Carter removing the buy-in aspect of food stamps, it also provided a few amendments to the Food Stamp Act. So looking at the Food Stamp Act amendment of 1970, passed in 1971, it established a uniform national standard of eligibility and work registration requirements. The Agriculture and Consumer Protection Act of 1973 also extended the program to drug addicts, alcoholics in treatment, and in generally rehabilitation centers. Finally, in the 70s, another aspect that changed the dynamic of how we understand food assistance programs would be in July of 1974, authorized the department to pay 50% of all states' costs for administering the program, obviously taking on the financial burden, the other 50% by the government. With that being said, we are looking at Linda Taylor. Now, Linda Taylor is in fact a real person, but the story that Senator Ronald Reagan, governor at the time, 1976 California Governor Ronald Reagan said at the time is not true. So what we also have going on, especially in the 70s, we also have the Vietnam War still continuing. Now that does end in 1975, but something to still note as far as adding additional strain to the public and to resources and how people understand. Now, with the war on drugs in 1971, that's when you start seeing different interesting racial stereotypes being correlated with groups of people and seemingly to be made fact. So let's look at a quote from Governor Ronald Reagan as he told a story to a North Carolina crowd in 1976. He quote says, "In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record," he said. "She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veteran husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year." So something to keep in mind is everything that he said to that crowd that day is completely false. Linda Taylor did not do any of these things. But unfortunately, where her name probably did come up and why she was even thought of in the rooms that potentially Ronald Reagan was in was because she had in fact developed a rap sheet of her own. Upon doing research on her, I see everything from selling drugs to kidnapping children, which I found very horrific. Attempted kidnapping. We have a murder charge potentially, but no swindling of the government. What also aided this narrative was, quote, "of a Cadillac driving, fur coat wearing welfare cheat helped Reagan to revive the conservative movement and take it to the White House." after Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater's landslide defeat by President Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So we have this reemergence of a conservative political party, more so of the conservative party that we understand today. Now, although Reagan doesn't mention race in the story, it is inevitably perpetuated of this, quote, myth of the welfare queen, as it contained not too subtle racial code as the new symbol of the undeserving poor. There's a quote by Josh Levin saying, the audience knew what this welfare swiping villain looked like. She was a lazy, Black con artist, unashamed by gauging the money that honest folk work so hard to earn. Something to keep in mind when we understand the origin of welfare queen. Yes, Linda Taylor exists. No, she did not do the things that were said, but she does not have the privilege of doubt. And so the government full force with trying to find out all of the information they could to confirm these allegations, taking Ronald Reagan's word over anything else. A very interesting and telling aspect of how we understand the stereotype of who is on welfare, why they're on welfare, and the personality types, and it's removing from need and turns into exploitation. Again, I think there's a dark irony in that as well. So let's go ahead and look at some statistics. And these statistics are from the SNAP website from 2019. Now, also please do keep in mind that I am fully aware of the racial demographic breakdown of the United States being majority white. But you also have to keep in mind that statistically, white people have more generational wealth than other races. So where is this balance of having 36.5% of total recipients being white when historically they hold the most wealth? Now, next we have African American with 25.8% of the total participants, Hispanic any race 16%, Asian 3.3%, and Indigenous 1.5%. Again, as we're cultivating questions and dissecting our own thoughts, relearning, unlearning, just keep in mind of what these statistics are telling of. I think there's also something to note that the division is unnecessary when poor is poor. So let's go ahead and move on to some thought-provoking questions. So as we understand what we've learned today, there will be materials provided with extra sources. But what are the components or aspects of poverty? Think broad strokes. What does it mean to be poor, especially generationally? How does that impact? Next question being, what factors would prevent someone from seeking food assistance? Do they think their situation is permanent, chronic, temporary? How might that change, along with understanding and dealing with the stigma that's associated with food assistance programs? What factors would prevent someone from growing their own food? In some places, it's illegal to keep rainwater. So what does that mean to those who want to maybe take some self-sufficiency back and grow their own food to a certain extent? If they're in urban areas, how are they able to do that? We see more community gardens going up, but to what rate that would help people on a larger scale? And how can we, as everyday citizens, do our part to change that? Since we began this lecture with political cartoons, I wanted to bring up some more recent ones. So as we look to the left, we see a cliff. We see a caricature of Obama texting on a phone, and attached to his car is a giant kennel, food stamp recipients. as he's texting, "Get bigger, kennel." If you are unaware, during Obama's time, he was called something to the effect of like the welfare president. With that being said, we also have to the right the current American employment cycle. Part-time job, probably in college here at number one, turn to a full-time job because he's graduated. Then inevitably companies have an ebb and flow themselves, downside to part-time, laid off, unemployment, food stamps, disability. This is where you have a bootstrap type of aspect, but this example is someone who is exploiting the system per some conservative thought. Some more thought-provoking questions before we wrap up. Why would women have higher rates of having and using SNAP? How does being a woman identifying person throw in the intersectionality of being BIPOC with children? How do they experience the stigma around food stamps? Think about how they would navigate and what obstacles they may run into. When white people have been the first recipients of a food stamp program as we know it today, how does a BIPOC identity alter the stereotypes of food stamp recipients? A little redundant, but just trying to get some ideas and get some thoughts flowing, and maybe asking things in different ways may help. So let's end with two more political cartoons. We have over here what looks like, we'll say, two white children for the sake of the conversation. We see the house is in shambles. Food is non-existent in the fridge. We see on the ground, drug test for food stamps. Little girl says, "Empty, but at least mama's saving a clean pea sample." Again, why as Americans are we understanding those who need food assistance as seemingly some of the worst citizens that we have, when we know that the ultra rich tend to evade taxes, but yet are more celebrated for, quote, working the system? But yet to engage in a food stamp program that is meant to uplift its citizens, these recipients are seen as exploiting systems, not wanting to ever pull themselves up. And as I mentioned, the Vietnam War before, as it lasted until 1975, starting in 1955, again, when we're talking about this cycle of relation to unemployment, food assistance, any other assistance programs, you have a line of men, and at the bottom, the caption says, "Last employment, Vietnam." So again, if we have this correlation of some of our unsavory members of society per stereotypes, but yet our most celebrated members of men and women in service who also need assistance, where is the hypocrisy, duality, and misunderstanding in how we are approaching, and where does bias lay in these assumptions? With that being said, I do appreciate your time and listening to this mini lecture of a brief history of food stamps. I will do my best to cite within the YouTube area below, but please let us know in the comments what thoughts were provoked by watching and listening to this. I will be happy to provide any further resources, but because this is through the university, please know that everything has been sourced appropriately. Again, my name is Kendall Taylor Wright. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.